Hey everyone, welcome to Resilience Unravelled. This podcast is a result of my fascination with subjects like resilience, accountability, burnout, life fulfillment and other life and work-based performance issues, as well as many of the other obsessions I bump into in my life. I spend my time working with highly successful teams, people and organisations, and this podcast introduces their remarkable stories and expertise, as well as my own synthesis of the key issues, strategies, tips, tools and resources to thrive in life. If you find this podcast useful, why not go over to our site qedod.com. If you'd like some resources on how to manage and beat burnout, head to qedod.com/burnout2019 for some goodies. Stay tuned to the end to find out details of how to order a free ebook. Enjoy the podcast. And today I'm talking to Dr. Sally Spencer-Thomas. You may remember a few podcasts ago I talked to Frank King about suicide and such like, and he referred to the book he was writing in collaboration with what he described as the brains of the outfit, and here are the brains. So, Dr. Sally Spencer-Thomas, good afternoon to you.
That's too funny. Thank you, Russell, so much for having me on the show today. And thank you to Frank King, my friend, and really the heart of the project.
No problem at all. So I obviously pick up from your accent that you're not from the fair shores of the United Kingdom. So where are you hanging out today?
So today I'm hanging out in the Washington, D.C. area, but my heart of my home is Colorado.
All right. Fantastic. Good. Well, thanks for joining us today. I'm very excited to talk to you. Before we get into the meat of the sort of the subject we're going to chat about, which is around men's mental health and suicide, why don't you just tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure, thank you. So I'm a psychologist by training, and was in the field of mental health in a number of ways. I was a counselor primarily for first responders and college students. And then I transitioned over to health and wellness for a while. And then I was leading a leadership development program at a university. And I was about 16 years in all of this experience when my brother died by suicide in 2004, after a very difficult battle with bipolar condition that proved to be fatal.
Wow.
And that major loss, we were just two siblings, one of my best friends in the world. That huge life transition got me very focused on trying to understand suicide and what we could do to prevent it. And that's led me in a couple of directions to, I guess, help make meaning out of a big tragedy in my life. And I feel like he walks with me through this.
Yes, I can imagine. And it gives you, I suppose, context and meaning for the work you do as well.
That's right. I always say, people with lived experience, loss survivors and suicide attempt survivors, we carry the flag forward in the movement because it's really hard to get funding. It's really hard to get the appropriate resources, but our pain and our challenges fuel our energy to keep going. And believe me, nobody does this for the money. So you gotta have another motivation to keep going forward and keep persisting.
Well, maybe we can talk a bit more about that before we talk about the men's mental health side, if you don't mind, because I was very taken when I chatted to Frank about this idea of suicide. And actually, it's quite tricky to work out the process that happens before someone actually takes their life, because, of course, very few people are there to talk about it afterwards, are they? So how do you make sense of the sort of decision or the process just before suicide takes place?
Well, let me say first that there are no universal narratives for suicide. There is not one pathway to it that's as diverse as there are people. But we look for common pathways. We look for ways that people might overlap in their process around this. And according to some work by Dr. Matthew Knock out of Harvard University, there are at least 5 kind of generalized categories of presentations of how people can come to this place of experiencing what we call suicide intensity. We like that term, suicide intensity, because it really is a better descriptor of kind of the fluctuations, the dynamic ebbs and flows of these feelings and thoughts, and kind of captures this whole body experience. So for some people, as Frank probably mentioned, he's one of them, that this is just always on the menu. It's fairly low level. It's just always there. And that's a whole different presentation than someone who is reacting strongly. We call it a surge in suicide intensity, reacting strongly to a precipitating event, not a cause, but an event that moves people from thought to action. This could be a major disruption in the primary relationship, or a major financial disruption, or a significant trauma or loss, something that just sends waves of the suicide intensity. And people don't think that they can cope with the overwhelming pain related to these events. Other groups have undulating suicide intensity. It kind of ebbs and flows throughout their life, not necessarily tied to any event. And some people have super high suicide intensity that's just like psychological torture. So all of these presentations are different, and each requires a different depth of understanding and a different type of intervention.
Mm. And I think that one of the biggest challenges in my experience of this, and I actually I had someone I knew very closely who committed suicide themselves, and there was no indication of it happening. They were effective at work. They were a sociable member of a team. It was, a lot of the time for a period afterwards, the people in his workplace, because he committed suicide at work, we were sort of, scratching our heads thinking, how could we have missed it? But I don't think necessarily, I think as Frank was explaining, people don't necessarily give the game away, do they?
Well, most people actually do, and their expression of it is often very indirect. So when we ask people who survived near fatal suicide attempts, so they should have died.
Yeah.
Did you ever communicate this to anyone? The overwhelming majority will say, yes, I did. But the way that they communicated and who they communicated to isn't necessarily obvious to everybody. But in their experience, sometimes they feel like they're shouting from the mountaintops. But they often, won't tell their closest friends or their family members or at people at work, but they might share it with somebody else. And so that's why we really advocate these what we call gatekeeper trainings. It's like CPR for suicidal despair, to teach people the different types of ways that people communicate, or as what we call invite people into the conversation. And they're often direct. The other thing that we really talk about now in suicide prevention is don't wait for the big red warning sign flag to come swooping in. Often it's not that obvious. We know that many people walk around with thoughts of suicide. It's a fairly common way that people cope with overwhelming pain in their lives. So rather than wait for a huge warning sign to smack you upside the head, you assume it's there. Just assume that suicide is on the menu, and you will behave differently. You'll ask different types of questions. You'll surround people with different types of supports. So it's not always clear, because a lot of people don't know what to look for, or don't know what type of life events or life changes can precipitate it. And of course, people of all different persuasions can have suicidal thoughts. It's not just kind of the person with severe mental illness who maybe is experiencing homelessness. It is all kinds of people in all kinds of demographics and all kinds of socioeconomic statics and all kinds of performance levels. It is a way that people navigate pain, and everybody has pain.
And is there a sort of a genetic link or anything along those sorts of lines to explain some of this?
There is a bit of a genetic load. When we look at identical twins raised apart, we do see, that's our kind of test for genetics. We do see shared risk for suicide, which tells us there's some kind of genetic piece to it. And I've heard a number of different explanations for this. Some believe that it may be tied to a genetic predisposition to impulsivity. Other people think that it's a genetic connection to what we also know are vulnerabilities for different types of mental health conditions that are tied to suicide, like addiction and depression and so forth. So I don't spend a lot of time looking at genetics because, if I'm honest, other than educating our youth that they might have a predisposition and to be on alert for that, there's not much we can do about genetics, at least not right now. So I would like to look at other ways that we can understand it in places that we can actually do work to get way upstream from the tragedy of suicide and build protective factors and catch things when problems are small.
So why not unpack a couple of those? So what sort of things can you do to protect?
Yes, this is probably my favorite part of suicide prevention. The farther we get upstream, the farther we get away from the absolute crisis, the life and death moment, the better we're going to be to save lives and to prevent suffering. If you think about it, if all we did for heart attacks was run around with AED machines and shock people back to life, we wouldn't be very effective in stopping heart attacks. We have gotten in front of heart disease by encouraging people to exercise and eat well and stop smoking and do all these other things. So getting in front of suicide looks a lot like building an A-team, building a quality social support network, not how many friends you have on Facebook, but your confidants, people you trust, people who've got your back, people who are willing to be there for you at 3:00 in the morning, having a real solid A-team that brings out the best in you. At least 3 to 10 people that you can turn to, and they turn to you. It's a group that pulls together, or a positive identity of a social group that really enhances your well-being. So whether that's a hobby or a faith community or something like that, a sense of a belonging to a positive social group that is really enhancing your life. The other upstream factor is really having a sense of mission and purpose, feeling like what you're doing in your life matters, that you're contributing to something larger than yourself. And again, this can often come through work or family, or service to the community, or just something where you feel like what you do matters and other people notice that you matter. Other upstream factors are really about mental health and suicide prevention literacy, that we have a certain level of understanding about what contributes to both our happiness and well-being, as well as what puts us in jeopardy for distress, overwhelm, and suicidal despair. And then we have knowledge about these things and the resources that we can help them. And it's just a matter-of-fact thing. It's nothing taboo or things that we hush and whisper in the corners. It's just like, where's the gym? These are just comments that we can make to one another to help one another, again, enhance our well-being. And there's many more, but those are some of the big categories. Purpose and belonging are really important.
That's fascinating. I think when Frank and I were talking, I was mentioning to him I'm writing a book about burnout and finding some correlation with burnout and suicide, but not necessarily strongly. But a lot of those things that you describe in there are actually similar in a way. And you've mentioned the word overwhelm 3 or 4 times now. So could you maybe unpack that a little bit more for me?
Yeah, sure. So again, no universal pathways to suicide, but one of the common things that many people experience is this sense of there's just so much coming at people, too big, too ugly, too fast, too many. And their ability to cope becomes compromised, shut down. It's just like whenever you get jammed up in a signal, something's going to short out. And so the experience isn't so much often for people as a free will choice, like what kind of shoes am I going to wear today or what I'm going to eat for breakfast, but it's more of an experience of succumbing. I have a good friend, David Covington, and he talks about how he was on Fear Factor in his 40s, and he was challenged to jump on this inverted bar at 40 feet in the air, and he was competing against all these 20-something guys. And he said, you know what, I know I'm not going to win, but I just want to get on that bar, and I want to hang on to that bar for just a little longer than these really fit 20-somethings. And you watch the video, and he leaps, he jumps, and he's on there for less than a second. And he says, you know what, everything in my body, everything in my will, everything in my soul wanted so much just to hang on to that bar for just a little longer. And I just couldn't. I just couldn't hang on. I had no choice. The pain was so great, I had to let go. And he said that experience has really gave him some compassion for other people who are experiencing this, again, too big, too ugly, too painful, too much, too many. And while they want to hang on, often they just can't. They're just overwhelmed to the point where they have no choice in their mind. They just succumb to the pain.
So they sort of give up, not give up, they surrender themselves to the...
Yeah, relinquish. Yeah,
Yes,
just...
relinquish, that's a good word, yeah. That's interesting. And of course, what we talk a lot about the person, the victim of suicide, as well, the perpetrator of suicide, or whatever the phrase might be. But it must be particularly difficult for the people left behind from suicide. I wondered, have you conducted a thought much about that sort of area?
Oh, yes. Well, I've lived through it, and I've also been with many, many other people through it. In the United States, we tend to call ourselves survivors of suicide loss. In the UK, the phrase is more bereaved by suicide, people who are bereaved by suicide. And it is, for me, the experiences was like a tsunami. So my brother died December 7th, 2004. It was right before his 35th birthday. It was right before his birthday because he was born on Christmas Eve. And it was before Christmas. And it was right before the Asian tsunami hit that rocked the world. Everybody was just totally overwhelmed by this international disaster. And when I looked back at our family's experience months later, it felt like our family had our own personal tsunami after his death. It was completely upending. The first several weeks were experiences, for me anyways, of drowning, fighting for every breath. Like your brain works so hard to make sense of something that's so incomprehensible. One of our forefathers, and we call him the granddaddy of what we call postvention, what happens after a suicide. He calls it the canyon of why. His name's Frank Campbell, and he's helped so many of us understand our grief experience and how many of us just fall into this canyon of why. And the experience is so very much like drowning. You cannot, night is day, day is night. You're not eating. And I had these overwhelming experiences of fear that just kind of followed me everywhere. I feared for my children. I was like, who's next? And it's very hard to function when you're in this state of really everything you assume to be true and safe and good in the world is shattered. And suicide's a trauma, really. And these are trauma responses, the kinds of things you would see after a sexual assault or a natural disaster or a car wreck. I think people don't realize the trauma level of suicide. And then after that, the experience was very much of just trying to come up for air and looking around my landscape and realizing like everything had moved, like nothing seemed the same as it was before. At the time, I was running a leadership program at a university, and I just loved my work. I loved working with the students. It felt to me like the best use of my psychology degree to help these young, bright, fresh, excited young people kind of find their way in the world and express their gifts. But when I came out of that experience of my suicide grief, just in those beginning days, like I could not find the joy in that work. I just couldn't care. I couldn't find any meaning in it or any motivation. And I really thought I was going to lose my job, which is, frankly, a common experience for loss survivors. They end up having these cascading domino effects. Mm. Yeah, ripple effects, aftershocks. I mean, the metaphor went on and on for me. And then ultimately, the rebuilding process took a lot of special teams. For me, it took a mental health community to kind of help me process grief and trauma. It took my workplace helping me with accommodations. It took my faith community to kind of just kind of create this soul care and a whole bunch of other things. So yeah, the aftermath is brutal. It's brutal for parents who lost children. It's brutal for kids who lose parents and siblings. And we don't talk about friends who lose friends or coworkers, but it's like, this huge tsunami effect. It just ripples out through space and time.
Mm. And it's a difficult thing to bring out. It's a difficult thing to bring out, but a lot of people describe suicide, people who perpetrate suicide, as being selfish. What's your sort of view on that?
Yeah, that's a really frustrating piece of misinformation that has been perpetrated for forever. And I get it. If you're just looking at the outside, it is maybe easy to make an assumption that somebody was being selfish or self-absorbed. But try living through it and see how you feel, because it's actually quite a different experience for most people. Dr. Thomas Joyner has written the book, Why People Die by Suicide, and he has spent decades looking at and understanding the suicidal mind and the risk for a risk model for suicide, and got his hands on just so many of our peer-reviewed journal articles to kind of do some meta-analysis of what drives people to this space. And his conclusion is actually, frankly, the opposite. That most people who experience suicide intensity are feeling this experience of perceived burdensomeness. This is what he describes, this psychological construct. It's perceived burdensomeness. They have come to the conclusion that they are such a burden to other people in their life, that their death has become worth more to the people who love them than their life is.
Yeah.
That in their mind, that they are doing other people, they're adding value to other people by going. And people make this conclusion in all different ways and in all different places. Some of it's a financial calculation. If there's been a financial disruption, the thinking is, well, if I go, my life insurance policy will kick in, at least in parts of the world. And, my family is going to get to keep the house, and the kids will go to school, and life will carry on. I'm a drain. Or I've done something humiliating or shameful, and I've brought pain to my family or my community. So if I go, I can take that pain away, and people don't have to feel my pain anymore.
And
And in all of these, we say because
I'm really pleased you bring that up, because I work a lot in the trans community, and there must be a higher percentage statistically of people in the trans community than the national average, and that's a lot about that, isn't it? It's about removing the burden of their problems from everybody else. And if we can do one thing today, it's to get rid of this idea that people who are suicidal are selfish, because it just is not true, is it?
Well, and it just sets us up for distancing ourselves from people who really need connection, for blaming and shaming people who really need, who could benefit from empowerment and compassion. It's just set us up to be adversaries rather than allies with people who are experiencing suicidal despair.
And it makes it trickier for the suicidal person, or the person with suicidal thoughts, to actually share what they're thinking, because if there's
so much fear of judgment. That people won't understand. And frankly, if you have that worldview, you're not going to understand. You're not going to really take the time to understand the pain.
So, is it? And I know sometimes psychologists are guilty of reductionism to the point of absurdity. But is it worth just actually asking people who you know and care for if they've ever had suicidal thoughts? I mean, is it as simple as that?
It is to start the conversation with compassion and assume that it's there. The only way we get to know. Currently there's no blood test, no CAT scan, no MRI, no X-ray. The only way we get to know is through conversation, and the only way that people will tell us, and there's a gazillion reasons why they won't, really good reasons why they will withhold this information. The only way is if we're trustworthy and we open up a conversation from a point of compassion, and I'm here with you, and I'm going to walk with you, and we're going to figure this out together, and I have ideas and resources we can explore together. I mean, that's the only way we get through this.
If you talk to someone and they tell you that they do have suicidal thoughts, but you are not gifted in the resource department, where are good places to be able to point someone to be able to give this sort of support?
That is where the rubber meets the road. So first of all, to all the listeners, if someone discloses to you that they're thinking about suicide, you have earned a gift. And so the first words out of your mouth should be thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for trusting me. When they might be expecting rejection or you to freak out or whatever, you come into this conversation with gratitude. That's going to get you off on a really good start. And then the next thing you should say is, I'm with you. One of the things that often happens when people disclose their suicidal thoughts is they start to get what we call hot potatoed. They start to get bounced around because everybody's very frightened. So some kind of expression of partnership and collaboration can also be helpful in letting that person know that you've got their back and that they're not going to navigate this alone, that you're going to walk with them. And then the third piece really is, and I have some ideas, and these resources, are different in different countries, but most countries have some kind of crisis line, and some kind of place that people can call together or text together. That's a great place to start. I also really encourage people to develop that A-team, to develop a list of 3 to 10 people they can call at any point in the day or night and just, show up and listen and be there for that person. We encourage people to develop some emotional regulation skills so that they can cope with their overwhelming pain. One of my resources that I always turn to is a website called Now Matters Now, nowmattersnow.org, and it teaches people dozens of these emotional regulation skills that they can try to kind of get through experiences of really intense feelings, whether it be dread or overwhelm or anxiety, just to help cope and get them to the other side. So my short version of this is get a list of crisis resources that are available in your community. Get a list of mental health resources. Some workplaces have employee assistance programs that you can get access to for free. Peer support programs like various 12-step groups or other types of peer outreach can be helpful for people. And then a list of self-soothing, distracting, and coping strategies that they can use on their own to start to empower themselves to live through these difficult experiences.
Fascinating. I wanted to go and talk about men's mental health, but I don't think I want to today, if that's okay with you, because I think what you talked about is so powerful. I'd like to keep the two things separate, if that's okay with you.
That's totally okay, Russell. I'd love to come back. I'd love to come back and talk about men's mental health and some of the initiatives we have in those spaces, as well as workplace stuff. If you ever want to go down that path, that's a big passion of mine as well.
Well, if people would like to know about you, how can they get hold of you or talk to you or contact you or see more of your work, Sally?
Yeah, thanks a lot. So my website is Sally Spencer, and that's a Spencer with a CER, sallyspencerthomas.com. I also have a podcast called Hope Illuminated, where I interview international thought leaders on their stories, science, and strategy for suicide prevention. And I'm on all the social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, YouTube. I would love to connect.
Not TikTok yet, then?
Not TikTok. I don't know TikTok, but the others. And don't get me started with Snapchat. Don't get me started. I have been the youth in my life have tried to teach me Snapchat forever, and it's just not sticking. So
I think
I give up.
The good news with Snapchat is it's sort of disappeared now, so you can forget about it.
Thank God.
Try TikTok, because it is one of the great wastes of our lives. But,
oh my gosh.
Sally, you've been an absolute joy to talk to today. Thank you so much.
Russell, I am so grateful to be asked. This has been an absolute pleasure, and thank you.
No problem. You take care.
All right, take care.
Thanks for listening today. You can go to our site qedod.com/podcasts and subscribe to hear other titles in our series. Or you can contact us at info@qedod.com to hear and find out more about tough love, leadership, accountability, resilience, and burnout. You can go to our site qedod.com/burnout2019 to hear and get access to a load of resources to help you manage and fight burnout. And you can go to qedod.com/free ebook to hear more about the fundamentals of resilience. Until the next episode, keep on thriving.